But first, a good job with decent pay, a happy marriage, 2.4 children, a home of your own even if it is mortgaged, a nice car. It's what a lot of men aspire to. It's a lot of what all of us aspire to. But are they the key to happiness? According to the Sunday Times columnist Matt Rudd, not necessarily. Having reached middle age with all the trappings listed above, Matt still found himself feeling stressed, anxious, and even fearful. And when he spoke to other men living similar lives, he found many of them felt the same way. He's made the subject the topic of a book, Man Down, Why Men Are Unhappy and What We Can Do About It. So, putting my feminist skepticism aside for the next 25 minutes or so, Matt is actually here in the studio with me, putting his head in his hands as I say feminist skepticism. Yes. Anyway, we're going to discuss men's happiness or lack of it. And it is actually serious. According to the Samaritans, men are 3 times more likely to commit suicide than women, and those aged between 45 and 49 have the highest rate of all. So, Matt is here, as I've just said, and you've just heard. We're also joined by Zac Fine, a psychotherapist who focuses on men's issues, and the philosopher Julian Baggini, whose most recent book is Life, a User's Manual, Philosophy for Almost Any Eventuality. Thank you all for joining me. Matt, can I start with you? Obviously, why are middle-aged men unhappy?
Yeah, well, that introduction does sound like we're going to have half an hour of moaning men. Successful moaning men, which is even worse, isn't it?
Even more painful,
and just to be clear, I don't have a nice car. I do have a heavily mortgaged house, though. But
okay, well, I'm glad you've cleared that up for us. But really, seriously, because we might as well be serious about it. You've been serious about it in your columns. Why are men primarily unhappy?
Yeah, well, as we know, as you said, there's this big spike in stress, anxiety, depression, and sadly suicide in this 45 to 49 year category. And a couple of years ago, that happened to me. I just suddenly started panicking. I was waking up at 3 o'clock every morning and catastrophizing, worrying about the job. We're in the building where my job is, so I need to be careful. But am I going to get fired? Hopefully not. Can I pay? What happens if I can't pay the mortgage? All of these things. And it was really annoying because I'd passed all the tests that you're supposed to pass. I'd done the exams, I'd got on the career ladder, found the one, then committed myself to 15 horrific years of parenting. And then finally they can do up their own car seat belts and wipe their bums.
Everything should be great.
Should be the best years of my life. And there I am worrying. And so my reaction was, should I go and, buy a sports car or some Lycra? But instead I started talking to men who I thought were doing fine, and they weren't either. And to answer the question, I think obviously we're pursuing success without ever really thinking whether success is, whether financial success or status is as important as happiness.
Well, we're going to continue talking about that in a moment, but I was just struck when you were describing your sleeplessness and your anxiety and those panic attacks and everything. I actually wrote an article about that very subject for another newspaper. I won't mention it because I don't want to get the sack either.
Yes, a lesser newspaper.
But, well, I'm not saying that. But actually, those are all symptoms of the menopause. And I just think that's quite interesting because you're talking about men slightly younger, but in middle age. And I'm wondering if there is something medical to be said about it as much as anything else, because obviously, with women, it's about, catastrophic hormone loss. I wonder if there is something going on. Maybe we'll get someone who knows about medical things to tweet us or to write into us. You can tweet us at Times Radio. You can email us at studio@times.radio. And you can even text us at 87222 and start your message with the word Times. We'd love to hear from you if you've got opinions on anything we're talking about today. Matt, you've talked about your own personal experience and what you were feeling and the fact that you then decided to reach out to men who you thought were feeling better. What do the statistics say about male unhappiness?
Well, as I said, there is this big spike from 45 to 49, and things improve once you stop caring so much about these things. So when you get to about 60, you're fine. Okay. Which is really bleak.
So you've just got a decade or nearly 2 decades to power through if you possibly can.
And I think it's particularly, every generation says it's really bad for my generation, but we are brilliantly, men are wanting to be more hands-on fathers, much more than even a generation ago. So there's the pressure between those two things. So the men I spoke to, they felt guilty about home when they were at work and guilty about work when they were at home, that they were missing out. So you have this difficult, between those two pressures, which we charmingly call work-life balance, there's actually very little time to think, pause, and find, it sounds selfish, but look after themselves.
It's so interesting because I don't want to keep bringing it back to women.
It's the same for women.
But it is very much the same for women. And I wondered if it's partly in that case related to the fact that men are now feeling the pressure domestically more than they ever did before, or responsibility domestically more than they ever did before. So whereas once you could just worry about your career and your paunch, now you've got to worry about your career, your paunch, and whether you're spending enough time with your children.
Yeah, all the men I spoke to, I don't know if they were worrying, but they wanted to, it's no longer a case of dragging us into, doing bedtime stories and some of the emotional labour. We want to do that. It's just that there isn't time, as many women have found out before.
So was it mainly about that tension, or what was the overall pattern? Why are middle-aged men so happy? Is it just that tension? What are the other
there are other
things?
The main difference between men and women is that men do not talk about this stuff. So all the problems are the same, but our ability to communicate that we're struggling has been blocked from the very beginning. From the moment you tell a kid to man up when they're trying to jump into a swimming pool, all the way through, you're instilling these very traditional male virtues to be strong, stoic, the full Rudyard Kipling.
Are you the full Rudyard Kipling? I mean, is that very much what your upbringing was about?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have a super strict one, but just the culture around it. And I've got 3 boys. And I was thinking about this the other day. I actually feel, if my son is crying a little bit unnecessarily because he's scraped his knee, I'm a little bit embarrassed for him because he's not being manly. And then at the same time, I've just spent 2 years looking into this. And there have been some amazing studies done on how the more kind of stoic and traditional and patriarchal your upbringing, the worse your outcomes in midlife. There's this thing called the man box, coined by one really big study across 20 countries, where they found the more traditional characteristics of maleness within the subjects, the harder they found it to have a happier life later on. So it's a feminist thing, really.
Okay, you can pass the ball back. But Zac, let me bring you in here. You're a psychotherapist specialising in men's issues. Do you recognise the patterns that Matt is talking about?
I do, but I'd just like to say that there's nothing wrong with Stoicism, in my opinion. And I think one of the issues here, I'm interested in attracting men in need to come and talk. And I think a lot of men are put off by the therapy industry having this very feminist perspective, which tends to, I hate the term toxic masculinity, but certain aspects of orthodox masculinity are held very negatively, and most therapists are women. And so I think there's a job, I think we're making tracks. I mean,
sorry, Zac, can I just check that out? So you're saying most therapists are women, and that therefore they're judging men if they display signs of supposed toxic masculinity. I raise my fingers in inverted commas. But Stoicism, I would say, is certainly not a gendered virtue. I would say that it's probably something displayed in women as much as it is in men.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that women can have masculine qualities and men can have feminine qualities, and actually we all have both. Every man has a anima inside him, which is his feminine self. And I think part of the deeper discussion about this is how we can bring men, help them come back to contact with their anima.
What's an anima? Just while we're here, for me and other ignorant listeners.
So you have an animus, so that's your inner masculine. So if I don't know how how well you know your Animus, but
we had a whole conversation with that. Yeah.
A lot about in terms of coming into contact with ourselves, and this is really the deeper point here: is men don't have very good relationships with themselves. They don't really know who they are, and this isn't just a cultural phenomenon. I mean, I agree with some of the stuff Matt was saying. Like we give boys capes and we encourage them to jump, climb trees, but these phenomena across species, we see that in chimps, and actually there's a deep biological, there's masculine archetypes that are located in deep brain structures. So physical protection and risk taking aren't just culturally derived. These are adaptive, evolutionary behaviors.
But Zac, are you saying that men are unhappy because they're uncomfortable about being men, or are you saying that men are unhappy because they're uncomfortable, and find midlife a very difficult time because of the expectations, rather than the expectations being removed from who they really are?
Well, yeah, one of the factors is masculine archetypes, sort of ways of behaving, are now being kind of prescribed. So it's almost like a double bind. So, I work with a lot of CEOs, and they're under intense pressure, obviously, to be competent and to manage high stress situations all through the week. And then they've got to deal with their home lives and everything else. And
so that echoes very much what Matt's been saying.
Are any of them happy, Zac?
Yeah. Well,
they're
not
talking to Zac.
But I'm not really interested in happiness. I think that's quite a shallow surface thing. I mean, one of the things I think you're talking about, Matt, I just read your article, is this place that men get to, and I think we all get to. It's what Carl Jung called the second half of life, where we've gone out into the world, we've proven that we're competent. So we've gone from a space of being idealistic young people to getting into the matrix of debt, work, all that stuff, your mortgage, all that stuff. And then we sort of wake up, and our kids are growing up, and we think, what is my life about? Why have I? And I think people start to realize that they've created their lives based on what they thought other people and wider cultural expectations expected of them. And then there's this very uncomfortable kind of space where now there's, if we can bear to take the space, often we keep ourselves busy because we don't want to. Unconsciously, we're trying to avoid it. But we start to come into contact with really deep questions, like existential questions, around the fact that we're going to die, we're ultimately alone, there really isn't any obvious meaning to life, and we're free to choose what we do. And they're all terrifying questions.
Julian, can I bring in Julian now, Zac? Julian, your latest book, Life, a User's Manual Philosophy for Almost Any Eventuality. What tips did you pick up from the ancients relating to this issue? And in particular, I mean, Zac sort of dismissed happiness as a pursuit, but it's enshrined in the American Constitution, and it's what most of us are after. Are you dismissing it too?
Not dismissing, but perhaps relegating it. By the way, you must have a strange typo on your notes. It's not called Life, a User's Manual. Perhaps a better title, actually. Life, a User's Manual. It's just one life there.
Oh, okay. Pardon me.
No, it's fine.
I'm just reinforcing your message.
No, there's lots which both speakers have said, which is very interesting. I think the happiness point is important, though, because
Thank
I think
goodness.
that
My God.
when we think about, well-being, the feeling of being good, that positive affect, as psychologists call it, actually, the idea that is the most important thing is highly questionable. And I don't think many philosophers have actually supported that. Jeremy Bentham, perhaps the 19th century utilitarian who thought that was all it was about. But you often hear, you'll hear Aristotle being quoted as saying that happiness is the ultimate goal. But the word he was using is eudaimonia, which is a Greek word. And it's much more about a sense of flourishing or thriving. And I think that actually is what really matters to people. It's a feeling that you're living your life in its fullest sense and reaching your fullest potential. And that's not always something which makes you feel good or happy or in a straightforward way. Wittgenstein very famously had a very troubled life, a difficult life. And on his deathbed, he said as his last words, tell them I've had a wonderful life. And yet, it was perfectly compatible with the fact that it hadn't been an easy life, hadn't been a very happy one, that it was a wonderful one.
See, it seems to me that it's a state of mind, Matt, that we all reach in midlife. And for some reason, maybe women reach it later, or maybe the menopause kicks it in or whatever. But what you're describing, a lot of what you're describing, I know is what a lot of women go through too. So is the difference here the fact that men do find it so difficult to open up? I was speaking to David Austin from the British Board of Film Classification this morning, which you may seem as an odd segue, but he was talking about the fact that a far smaller number, I think less than 1 in 5 boys will go to their parents if they've watched something that's disturbed them and talk to them about it, a far larger proportion of women. So it clearly starts very young. And if that's become your pattern all the way through your life, I mean, women, we talk. Look, I'm doing it now. We talk, and we talk to each other, and I feel like we express ourselves better, and that's somehow cathartic, and men struggle to do that. Do you agree?
Exactly. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. It is. I think the experience might be the same, but our tools to deal with it feel differently. I mean, I've listened to both of the contributors,
Zac and
they're
Julian,
both
yeah.
Yes, Zac and Julian, and they both made brilliant points. But if we're talking about it's something that happens, and then we work through it, and we find our second life. To me, that's quite depressing. Is this phase inevitable? Are these doldrums inevitable?
Or maybe liminal. Maybe it's something that we move through.
Yeah, well, maybe you have to be miserable to end up being happy, even though we're not sure if we want to be happy now. But it's for me frustrating that in my mind, I've passed all these tests, as have everyone else I've spoken to, and then you're greeted by this middle phase. And I did talk to older people, and I went and spent some time in a shed in Sussex full of older men, and I asked them, what it was. They all said, I wish I'd done this and this and this differently. And we know that's, once you get to a certain age, you wish you'd never worked and had loads of fun. But they were all talking about how you have to develop a passion, which is, it's hard to hang on to that stuff when you're in the sort of peak dependency period of midlife.
And do you think that all men worry about the same things? I mean, you've talked about sitting with older men there, but, does class, does wage bracket or ethnicity, do any of those play a role, do you think? I mean, there is the theory, of course, that if you've got too much time to think about how you're feeling, then you will register your feelings more dramatically than you might if you don't. So if you are, working class out there, just struggling to make a living and keep a roof on your head, you're not going to have the luxury, perhaps, of the navel-gazing.
Becoming miserable.
Yes.
And moaning a lot. I spoke to people over the last 2 years of all walks of life, and as Zac will hopefully concur, there are a lot of very stressed, miserable CEOs. They don't have time, they're doing.
But they're in the upper echelons of wage bracket and
then
so
there's
on.
the middle management. They're also miserable and stressed, if they're being really honest. I did find one really happy person. Do you want to know who the happiest?
Yes, please.
So he was in his 20s and setting out to pass all the tests. He'd got a mortgage and a serious relationship, and he was setting up a burglar alarm installation company on the south coast, right? And he was installing burglar alarms for old people all day, because they tend to be more likely to have burglar alarms. And they were all saying, I wish I was your age. I wish I'd done this, this, and this. So he had this all day long. And long story short, he ended up living in a caravan by the side of Loch Ness, where he's been for the last 35 years.
Okay,
now,
well,
he
there's an
found
answer.
his passion.
Yes.
I don't think that works when you tell that to a midlife person, because they don't feel they've got the room for manoeuvre.
See, I think there's a lot to do with this, men opening up and their ability to communicate what they're feeling. Alistair Campbell was on the show last week talking about learning to live with his depression, and I asked him about this very subject. We have a short clip of what he replied.
But I think if you would say, in general, do women reach out more readily for emotional and psychological support than men? I think they do. And I think the reasons for that go back to, the kind of decades and centuries of civilization and how it's developed, where the man is strong and the man shouldn't show weakness, and the man is the hunter, and all that stuff. And all I say to young men in particular who are struggling is that, I would never tell somebody else how to deal with their own feelings and their own condition. But all I would say is that from my perspective, the single biggest, I think, booster rocket to any recovery I've ever had has been being open about it.
Zac, do you think it is getting easier for men to talk about their emotions now? I mean, obviously you're in the business of getting them to talk about what they're feeling, but have you seen an upsurge?
Yeah, I have a feeling that it's becoming more mainstream, definitely. But I still think there's a lot of kind of conceptual blockages with just in our, like you mentioned at the beginning, maybe this is a medical issue.
No, I've said that for women it becomes a medical issue. I wonder if there is something in male physiognomy that also struggles at this particular period in life.
Yeah, and I think, for anyone to live essentially kind of cut off from their relationships because they're working so much and they're caught up in all the stress of all the stuff that Matt's described, like that is a medical issue really, because the body, mind and soul are so connected. So we've got this, we tend to sort of silo things and compartmentalize things, but really, and we sort of medicalize death and we medicate anxiety and pain. And I heard when Matt was talking earlier, he sort of has this sense of frustration. You have this sense of frustration, Matt, that you've passed all these tests. So why is life so hard?
Yeah.
And I think the proposition is false. It's a fantasy to think that if you pass all these tests, you're going to be happy. It just happens to be the way that our reality is constructed.
But there are also other contributing factors, aren't there? I mean, friendship seems to be an issue, Matt. Men let their friendships slip. I know I'm generalizing, but it is. And Zac, to you too.
Well.
And sorry, what did you say?
Community.
And community. But yeah, and I think friendship is very much that thing, men get married and they let their friendships slip and they grow older and they, you've written about it in your columns, Matt, about, seeing friends maybe twice a year instead of twice a week and so on. And in fact, there was a survey in an Irish newspaper that said that there was an epidemic of friendlessness amongst men in this particular age group. So it plays into the same thing, doesn't it? I mean, firstly, there aren't the people there to talk to, and secondly, if they were, would you still just be talking about beer and football and what else do you talk about, guys?
Yeah, well,
Matt,
you pretty much got it. You've summed it up there. I mean, I completely agree with that, and I mean, I also agree with Zac about it being a fantasy, but wouldn't it be better if we worked that out earlier, right from the very beginning, and in the way we parent and in the way we move through adolescence? That's the philosophical question, I suppose.
I mean, one academic, Zac, has said it's time to stop trivializing midlife crisis. I presume they meant for both sexes, but is that perhaps true? I mean, we need to recognize it as an issue rather than mock it, and the male one has always been ripe for mockery, hasn't it? It's the fast car, it's the tight lycra, it's the extreme sports.
Yeah, and with respect, that sort of tone came in at the start of the program, and I'm not saying that I'm putting a judgment on that, but it tends to be there's always sniggers around the issue of like how are men doing, especially white men, because of course they're doing really well, but this is really sad. I mean, a lot of men are dying, and at their own hands, and why can't we create a slightly different world where we talk about these things, as families, but also in education? We don't have a lot of. Again, I think this is maybe changing. I think schools are starting to get more literate in emotional intelligence.
So, if there was something you could suggest, what would it be that would change the view around male depression, particularly in middle age?
Teach your son, if you've got a son, teach him to meditate. Spend time with him walking in nature, get him to have real conversations at the dinner table don't let him look at his phone, and ask him really searching, difficult questions, encouraging him to kind of really think about what he wants his life to be like and what his values are. Because a lot of men, me included, I was very idealistic, as most people are when they go to university, if they get to go to university. And then after 15 years in the grind in London, I worked in journalism. I kind of completely lost touch with what my actual values were, and then it took a while to kind of remember that I was still the same person I had been as a teenager, and that's quite a profound rediscovery. And if you're trapped in this kind of hamster wheel of working and looking after kids, you might not have the opportunity to remember that.
Matt,
yeah, I think that's true, and I think what you said about raising kids is correct. I've done all of those things. The phone is the thing that I've failed at. The eldest, we were quite good with tech. The middle one, less so, and the youngest, particularly during the homeschooling, working from home nightmare of the last few months, I've lost that.
But I think it is also a very important, from what Zac's saying there, I have a son as well, and it's very easy to let them assume the demeanor of a normal boy, and let them get away with not talking to you, and let them get away with not expressing what they're feeling, and let them step into the world thinking that that's how they need to be. It's quite a good sort of wake-up call, if you will, about raising boys fit for this world rather than 100 years ago. Julian, I wondered if there's a line or even just one philosopher who you find particularly galvanizing or relevant to this discussion.
I think all of them, to be quite honest, because Matt just sort of hinted at the end, there's a philosophical issue here, and I think that, and he says he wished, could have worked this all out before and not lived through it. And I think that what the philosophers help us do more than anything is to remember that the thing you've got to be most clear about is your values, what really matters in life, what is really important. And so many of these crises are based on the fact that people construct their lives around things which seem to have value because society valorizes them, achievement, success, in very narrow terms, often to do with career and money and perhaps family. And then they get these things and realize actually, at the very least, that's leaving a hole. And I think one of the things actually which we ought to value a lot more, and this is something which you find in both Confucius and Aristotle and other philosophers, is actually the idea that the real achievement of life is to become our best selves. It's this idea of self-cultivation. Cultivate your person is Confucius's kind of main sort of instruction. And I think so much we're not doing that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of strive after successes, which are external benchmarks, passing exams and so forth. And we're not actually working on ourselves. We don't even take that idea of work on the self-importance. Self-improvement is often based around the things which will give you success, will make you more attractive. It's not about becoming a better person within yourself. And I think that, and we're in a culture where philosophy doesn't have a very strong place. And I think it'd be much better if people did expose themselves a bit more to that so that they could,
Matt, have you found any answers? I mean, are you about to buy a caravan and head for Loch Ness?
No, because I have to say that Julian sounds very much like my wife there. I have to do the work. I've got to get on with this. And I think that's absolutely right. The problem is that when you say those things to someone who feels quite trapped, they feel they're on the defensive, as I say, this circular catastrophizing inner story they're telling themselves, having that kind of, you've got to find your, however you put it, you just feel like that's completely impossible. So as both of you said, the first step is to start being more communicative.
Do you think of it as possibly a form of depression?
I mean, certainly some of the men I spoke to, I'm obviously not in any way qualified to judge, but it was a...
I'm talking about with you.
I think I'm absolutely fine, is the official
Oh dear,
response,
you're going to be a tough case
it?
to crack, aren't you, Matt?
Everything's fine.
Matt Rudd, the Sunday Times columnist. psychotherapist Zac Fine, and the philosopher, journalist, and author Julian Baggini. Thank you all for joining me. Matt's book, Man Dan, Why Men Are Unhappy and What We Can Do About It, is published by Hachette and is available tomorrow. Julian's book, Life, Just the One Life, a user's manual, philosophy for almost any eventuality, is published by Ebury Press and is available now. Matt, I know you put your head in your hands there. Do you have a final word that you'd like to
The one
express?
thing I would
Yes.
like to say is that the thing that needs to happen soonest is that we have equal paternity leave to maternity leave. Because I've got 3 kids and I had 3 weeks off, and that would make things much more equal for both genders.
Well, that's a very good practical suggestion as well. Thank you very much. And if you're affected by any of the issues we've discussed, please contact the Samaritans.